In the suffocating darkness of a Virginia plantation in 1852, a woman risked everything humanity told her she had no right to possess, teaching enslaved souls that the keys to freedom were hidden in 26 letters most would never live to master. Before we begin this journey into the extraordinary life of Rebecca Hayes, make sure to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss stories of courage that changed the world forever. Because what you're about to witness will challenge everything you thought you knew about the power of education and the unbreakable human spirit. The moon hung low over the Thornhill plantation that September night, casting pale silver across the tobacco fields that stretched toward a horizon Rebecca Hayes had dreamed of touching for 28 years. The air was thick with moisture, carrying the scent of earth and pending rain, and somewhere in the distance, a whippoorwill called out its lonely song. Rebecca stood at the window of the small cabin she shared with 7 other enslaved women, her fingers tracing invisible letters on the rough wooden sill, practicing movements she had memorized in secret, movements that could cost her everything. She had learned to read at 12 years old, a forbidden gift accidentally bestowed when the plantation owner's sickly daughter, Charlotte Thornhill, had asked young Rebecca to sit with her during lessons with the governess, Miss Adelaide Porter, a stern woman from Boston who had initially protested but eventually ignored Rebecca's presence in the corner of the sunlit schoolroom. Those stolen moments had changed Rebecca's life forever. The mind, Miss Porter had once said, not knowing Rebecca absorbed every word, is the only territory that cannot be colonized without consent. Rebecca had taken that phrase and held it close to her heart like a talisman, understanding even then that knowledge was the one possession no master could strip away, no auction block could sell, no whip could destroy. Charlotte had died of consumption at 14, and Miss Porter had returned north, but the seeds planted in that schoolroom had taken root in soil the Thornhills never intended to cultivate. Now, 16 years later, Rebecca had decided that what had been given to her by accident must be passed on by design. She turned from the window and looked at the sleeping forms of the women around her. Dinah, who worked in the big house kitchen, Celia, whose hands were scarred from years in the tobacco fields, Sarah, who had buried 3 children before they reached their 5th birthdays, Miriam, whose back bore the marks of defiance, Esther, who sang spirituals that made even the hardest hearts weep, and young Lizzie, barely 15, whose eyes still held a flicker of something the overseer Samuel Crenshaw hadn't managed to extinguish. Rebecca had chosen them carefully, not for any particular skill or station, but because she had seen in each of them a hunger that went beyond bread, a thirst that water couldn't satisfy. Tonight would be the first night. Tonight, she would begin teaching them what no law said they had the right to learn, and the risk made her hands tremble even as her resolve hardened like iron and fire. The plantation bell had rung hours ago, marking the end of another day of unpaid labor under the brutal Virginia sun, and most of the enslaved community had fallen into the exhausted sleep of those who must rise before dawn to do it all again. But Rebecca had asked these 6 women to stay awake, to meet her in the corner of the cabin where shadows gathered thickest, and though she hadn't told them why, they had agreed, because trust among the enslaved was a currency more valuable than gold. She moved quietly across the cabin floor, her bare feet making no sound on the packed earth, and gently touched Dinah's shoulder. The older woman's eyes opened immediately, alert despite the hour, and she nodded once before rising to wake the others. Within minutes, all 6 women sat in a tight circle on the floor, their faces illuminated by a single candle Rebecca had traded 2 weeks of her meager rations to obtain from Joseph, the blacksmith, who had his own secrets and his own forms of rebellion. "What I'm about to show you," Rebecca whispered, her voice barely audible above the sound of crickets outside, "can get us all killed, or worse." She paused, letting the wake of those words settle over them like morning fog. "But it can also set us free in ways Master Thornhill and his kind can never understand." Celia leaned forward, her weathered face creased with curiosity and caution. "What kind of freedom you talking about, Rebecca? Ain't no freedom for folks like us, not in this life." Rebecca reached into the folds of her dress and pulled out something she had kept hidden for years, a small book, its leather cover worn smooth by countless secret readings, a volume of poetry Charlotte Thornhill had given her weeks before her death, pressing it into Rebecca's hands with feverish urgency and whispering, "Hide this, never let Father find it, but don't forget it either." The women stared at the book as if it were a living thing, dangerous and magnetic all at once. "I can read," Rebecca said simply, and the words hung in the air like a confession
of you been allowed to know exist, and I'm going to teach you." Sarah's eyes widened, and she glanced nervously toward the door. "Rebecca, they hang people for that. They cut off fingers, put out eyes, worse things I don't even want to name." Miriam placed a hand on Sarah's arm. "Let her talk." Rebecca opened the book, its pages yellowed but still intact, and pointed to the first word on the first page.
"This word is when," she said, her voice gaining strength. W-H-E-N. 4 letters that together make a sound, and that sound has meaning, and that meaning can unlock every thought that ever was or ever will be. She looked up at their faces, seeing fear and wonder warring in their expressions. "Master Thornhill thinks we're property because we can't read his bills of sale, can't write our own passes, can't count well enough to know when he's cheating us of our already stolen wages. But what if we could?" Young Lizzie spoke for the first time, her voice small but clear. "My mama used to say that reading was white folk magic, that it would curse us if we tried." Rebecca smiled gently. "Your mama was protecting you the only way she knew how, child. But reading isn't magic, and it isn't white. It's human. It's as human as breathing, as loving, as hoping. They've just convinced us otherwise, so we'll stay in chains, even when the shackles come off." Esther, who had been silent until now, began to hum softly, a spiritual Rebecca recognized, one about crossing over Jordan, and somehow the melody gave courage to them all. "Show us," Dinah said finally, speaking for the group. "Show us these letters, and we'll decide if the risk is worth the reward." And so it began. Rebecca smoothed the dirt floor and, using a stick, began drawing the first letter, a simple A, explaining how it sounded, how it could change depending on what followed it, how it was the beginning of everything. The women watched with the intensity of those seeing a miracle, and in a way they were. For the next 2 hours, until the candle burned too low to be safe, Rebecca taught them the first 5 letters of the alphabet, making them repeat the sounds, trace the shapes in the air, whisper the names, until muscle memory began to form. When they finally lay down to sleep, the cabin was the same as it had been, but something fundamental had shifted. A revolution of the mind had begun in whispers after midnight. The days that followed established a rhythm of dangerous secrecy. Rebecca worked in the big house as a lady's maid to Abigail Thornhill, the master's new wife, a woman 20 years his junior who had come from a declining Charleston family and brought with her expensive tastes and cheap cruelties. During the day, Rebecca dressed Abigail's hair, laced her corsets, and endured her petty tyrannies with a face that revealed nothing, while her mind recited letters, practiced words, and planned lessons for the night ahead. Abigail Thornhill was the kind of woman who wielded her limited power with vindictive precision, finding fault with every task, demanding impossible standards, and delighting in the discomfort of those she considered beneath her. "Rebecca," she would say, her voice dripping with false sweetness, "surely you can do better than this, or are you simply too dim to understand what proper service looks like?"
Rebecca would bow her head and murmur apologies while thinking of the words she would teach that night, turning Abigail's insults into fuel for her secret fire. Each evening, after the plantation settled into exhausted sleep, the circle would form again in the cabin. Sometimes all 6 women could attend, sometimes only 3 or 4, depending on who the overseer Crenshaw had worked to the point of collapse, or who was needed in the big house for late duties. But they came when they could, and they learned with a hunger that astonished even Rebecca. Dinah, at 43, had the hardest time, her fingers stiff from years of kitchen work, her eyes struggling in the dim light, but her determination was absolute. "I got a grandson," she told Rebecca one night as she struggled with the letter Q. "He's 6 years old, and he's smart, smarter than any child I've ever known. If I can learn this, I can teach him before they break his spirit like they broke his daddy's." Celia learned quickly despite her lack of formal practice, her mind sharp from years of calculating tobacco weights and yields in her head to catch the overseer's attempts to cheat the enslaved workers of their meager Saturday privileges. Sarah wrote her first word, hope, 3 weeks into the lessons, and cried silently as she traced it over and over in the dirt, as if the act of writing it made it more real, more possible. Miriam approached learning the way she approached everything, with fierce intensity and no patience for her own mistakes, pushing herself until Rebecca had to gentle her back, reminding her that freedom was a journey, not a destination to be seized in a single night. Esther connected every letter to a note, creating songs about the alphabet that made memorization easier for everyone, her spirituals taking on new layers of meaning as she wove literacy into lyrics that could be sung in the fields without suspicion.
and young Lizzie bloomed like a flower given water for the first time, her natural intelligence finally finding an outlet, her questions growing more sophisticated by the week until Rebecca realized the girl might one day surpass her teacher. But danger was never far away. The Thornhill plantation was overseen by Marcus Thornhill, a man whose family had owned this land for 3 generations and whose belief in the absolute right to own human beings was as unshakable as his faith in the God he claimed sanctioned it. He was not the worst of his kind. He didn't relish physical punishment the way some masters didn't visit the cabins at night with the vile intentions that haunted too many enslaved women's nightmares, but his evil was perhaps more insidious for being calm, rational, systematic.
Marcus Thornhill genuinely believed that enslaved people were better off under his care than free in a world they were supposedly too simple to navigate, and this paternalistic delusion made him vigilant against anything that might disturb the order he considered natural and divinely ordained. His overseer, Samuel Crenshaw, was a different breed entirely. Crenshaw was a poor white man who had clawed his way to his position and defended it with brutal efficiency, seeing in every enslaved person a potential threat to his precarious status. He watched everyone with suspicious eyes, listened for whispers of discontent, and punished infractions with enthusiastic cruelty, as if the violence he enacted proved his superiority over those he was paid to control. Rebecca had learned to be invisible around Crenshaw, to never meet his eyes, to move with neither haste nor slowness, to be present but unremarkable. But invisibility had its limits, and she knew that eventually someone would notice something: a woman too tired from late nights, a question too intelligent, a glance at written words that lasted a moment too long. The first close call came 6 weeks into the secret lessons. Rebecca was in the Thornhill Library, a room she was allowed to enter only to dust, and which she had mapped in her memory like a treasure vault, when Marcus Thornhill entered unexpectedly. She immediately lowered her eyes and stepped back, but not before he saw her standing near the bookshelf, a volume of essays in her hand. "What are you doing with that?" His voice was sharp, suspicious. Rebecca's heart hammered against her ribs, but she kept her voice steady and dull. "Dusting it, Master Thornhill. Mrs. Thornhill said these shelves was looking poorly kept." She held the book out to him, her hands deliberately clumsy, as if the object was foreign and meaningless to her. "I was just wiping it down, sir." He took the book from her, his eyes searching her face for any sign of comprehension, any hint that she understood the value of what she held. Rebecca had learned long ago to make her face a mask, to let her eyes go vacant, to embody the very stereotype that people like Thornhill believed in. "Books are not for the likes of you to handle," he said finally, replacing the volume carefully. "Stick to the furniture and the floors. I'll speak to Mrs. Thornhill about which rooms you should be cleaning." She bobbed her head in a gesture of submission, but inside her mind was racing. This was a warning. She would have to be more careful, more strategic, more aware of who was where and when. That night she told the women what had happened, and they all understood the implicit threat. "Maybe we should stop for a while," Sarah suggested, her voice tight with fear, "just until things settle down." But Miriam shook her head fiercely. "If we stop every time there's danger, we'll never learn nothing. Danger ain't going nowhere, not for people like us."
Rebecca looked at each of them, weighing their safety against their hunger for knowledge, trying to calculate odds that no mathematics could accurately measure. "We vote," she said finally. "This can't be my decision alone. We all take the risk, so we all decide. Who says we keep going?" 6 hands rose in the dim light, including Sarah's after a moment's hesitation. "Then we keep going," Rebecca said, "but we get smarter about it. We learn the sounds of different footsteps. We post Lizzie as a lookout since she's got the sharpest ears. We have a signal if someone approaches, and we hide everything twice as well as we have been." They agreed, and the lessons continued, but now with the sharp edge of confirmed danger making every whispered word feel both more precious and more perilous. As autumn deepened into winter, the secret school in the cabin grew more sophisticated. Rebecca had managed to acquire more materials through careful trades: a slate and chalk from Joseph the blacksmith in exchange for mending his shirts, scraps of paper from the big house trash that she painstaking over before anyone could question where they went, a second book, a Bible that had belonged to an overseer who died of fever, which she had found in the trash and rescued. The Bible became their primary text, partly because its presence could be explained if discovered. Enslaved people were often encouraged to hear scripture read to them as a means of reinforcing obedience, and partly because several of the women already knew many passages by heart and could thus connect the written words to familiar sounds. Rebecca taught them to recognize the names of biblical characters first: Adam, Eve, Moses, Ruth, names that appeared repeatedly and gave them confidence. Then came the action words: spoke, went, saw, heard,
words that appeared in every story and every sentence. Dinah made a breakthrough when she realized that the word Lord appeared hundreds of times and could be her anchor for finding her place in any passage. She began using it like a landmark, and her reading speed improved dramatically. Celia discovered that she could understand written numbers easily, perhaps because she had been secretly counting and calculating for years, and she began to help the others with that aspect of literacy that could be most immediately practical, understanding weights, measures, and the arithmetic of exploitation. Sarah wrote letters to her dead children, prayers and promises on scraps of paper that she would burn in the cabin's small fire, sending them to heaven as smoke, finding in the act of writing a form of grief that spoken words couldn't provide. Miriam began copying passages from the Bible that spoke of freedom and deliverance, the Exodus story becoming her obsession, and she would recite the verses she had written until they were seared into her memory, weapons of hope she could deploy against despair.
Esther composed a spiritual about the alphabet, disguising the lesson in melody so complete that it could be sung openly in the fields, each letter represented by a biblical image or metaphor. A is for Adam, who God made from clay. B is for Bethlehem, where Jesus did lay. And so on through Z for Zion, where we'll rest someday. And soon every enslaved person on the plantation knew the song without knowing they were learning their letters. Young Lizzie showed an aptitude for writing that exceeded even Rebecca's early abilities, her letters forming with increasing elegance, her spelling improving with each attempt, her hunger for more knowledge insatiable. "Miss Rebecca," she asked one night, her young face serious in the candlelight, "when we know how to read and write as good as white folks, what then? What do we do with it?" It was the question Rebecca had been asking herself from the beginning, and she didn't have a complete answer. "We use it to be free in our minds first," she said slowly, "and maybe, somehow, someday, in our bodies too. But even if that day never comes for us, Lizzie, we'll have taken back a part of ourselves they tried to steal. We'll have proved we're human in the fullest sense, no matter what their laws say." But freedom of the mind was not enough for everyone, and that winter the lessons took a turn Rebecca hadn't fully anticipated. Celia approached her one evening before the circle formed, her face set with determination. "I want to learn to write passes," she said quietly. "I want to learn to forge Master Thornhill's hand." Rebecca felt ice slip down her spine. Teaching reading and writing was dangerous enough, but forging documents was an entirely different level of risk, one that could lead not just to whipping or branding, but to hanging, to being made an example for every enslaved person in Virginia. "Celia," she began, but the older woman cut her off. "My son is up in Richmond, sold off 3 years back when Master Thornhill needed cash for a bad tobacco year. I ain't seen him since he was 12, and now he's 15, and I'm running out of time before this life grinds me to nothing. If I could write a pass, if I could make it look official, I might could get to Richmond and back before anyone notices I'm gone. I might could see my boy one more time." Rebecca understood the desperation behind the request, had felt it herself more times than she could count, but she also understood the mathematics of risk and consequence. If you're caught with a forged pass, they'll trace it back to who taught you. It won't just be you who pays, Celia. It'll be all of us, everyone in this circle, maybe everyone who can read on this whole plantation. The other women had been listening, and now Dinah spoke up. "She's right to ask, Rebecca. What good is reading if we can't use it to save our own? My grandson is still here, but for how long?"
"Thornhill's been talking about selling some of the young ones. I've heard him discussing it with that slave trader from Mississippi. If I knew how to write passes, maybe I could save that boy." Rebecca closed her eyes, feeling the weight of leadership she had never asked for but somehow acquired. This was the moment she had perhaps known would come, when the secret school would have to decide if it was only about personal enlightenment, or if it would become something more dangerous, more active, more like rebellion. "If I teach you to forge passes," she said finally, opening her eyes, "then we're not just breaking the law against teaching literacy. We're actively helping people escape, and that makes us all part of the Underground Railroad, whether we connect with it or not." Miriam leaned forward. "Maybe that's what we should be, Rebecca. Maybe this was always heading that direction." Rebecca looked at young Lizzie, trying to gauge if the girl was ready for this escalation of risk, but Lizzie's eyes were clear and certain. "My mama was sold down to Louisiana when I was 9, the girl said quietly. "I barely remember her face now, but I remember her telling me to be smart, to survive, to find a way. Maybe this is the way." The vote was silent but unanimous, 6 sets of eyes meeting Rebecca's with the same message: teach us everything, no matter the cost. So Rebecca began teaching them not just to read and write, but to analyze documents, to understand the language of passes and ownership papers, but practice the particular flourishes of Marcus Thornhill's signature until they could reproduce it with dangerous accuracy. She showed them how to age paper so it wouldn't look too fresh, how to create ink from berries and soot that would match the color of legitimate documents, how to fold and crease papers to suggest they had been carried in pockets and consulted multiple times. Joseph the blacksmith became an unwitting partner in this new phase when Rebecca approached him carefully one evening near the forge, speaking in low tones about hypothetical situations, and gauged his reaction. To her surprise, Joseph revealed that he had been part of 3 successful escapes over the past 2 years, providing tools and information to those brave or desperate enough to run. "I can't read or write," he admitted, "but I've been wishing I could do more than just point north and hope. If you're teaching that, Rebecca, and if you're using it for freedom, then I'll help however I can." He became their source for information about slave catchers' patterns, about which roads were safest and which were watched, about contacts in towns along the route north who might help, about the Underground Railroad's actual networks and how to find them.
Together, they formed the nucleus of something that Thornhill and Crenshaw would have moved heaven and earth to destroy if they had known it existed. A resistance movement built on literacy and courage, operating in whispers after midnight. The first pass they created was for Celia's journey to Richmond. Rebecca and the others spent 3 nights perfecting it, copying Marcus Thornhill's signature from a bill of sale Rebecca had managed to temporarily borrow from the office, matching the exact wording of legitimate travel passes they had seen, aging the paper until it looked several weeks old. Bearer Celia, enslaved property of Marcus Thornhill, Thornhill Plantation, Charles City County, Virginia, is permitted to travel to Richmond for the purpose of delivering goods to merchant Thomas Waverley, to return within 3 days of issue, this 14th of January, 1853. Rebecca handed the pass to Celia with trembling hands. "You have to be careful. If anyone questions it closely, if anyone compares the signature to a real one, if you're stopped by someone who knows Thornhill personally and knows he never sends enslaved people to Richmond alone, this won't hold up." Celia took the paper and held it like the precious thing it was. "I know the risks, Rebecca. I'm choosing them with my eyes open." She left on a Saturday night, using the cover of darkness and the confusion of a traveling merchant's caravan that passed near the plantation, and for 3 days the women in the cabin lived in a state of suspended terror, jumping at every sound, wondering if each moment would bring Crenshaw and a mob of armed men to drag them all to punishment. But on the 4th morning, Celia returned, slipping back into the cabin just before dawn, her face streaked with tears but glowing with something the others had almost forgotten existed: joy. "I saw him," she whispered. "I saw my boy, and he's tall now, nearly grown, and he's working in a tobacco warehouse, and he's alive, and he remembered me. We had 2 hours together before I had to leave, and I got to tell him I loved him, got to hear his voice, got to hold him one more time." She pulled out the pass and kissed it before handing it back to Rebecca. "This piece of paper gave me something I thought I'd never have again. It gave me memory I can touch, not just grieve." The success of Celia's journey emboldened the group, but it also made them targets of their own rising ambition. If they could write passes for visits, could they write passes for escape? If they could forge one signature, could they forge the documents needed for permanent freedom? These questions hummed beneath every lesson now, unspoken but understood by all. Rebecca tried to counsel patience, to remind them that every successful forgery made the next one more dangerous, because patterns would emerge, inconsistencies would be noticed. But she was also aware that patience was a luxury those in chains could not always afford.
Then came the night that changed everything. It was late February, the Virginia winter biting cold even inside the cabin, when a young man named Samuel, no relation to the overseer, but bearing the burden of that shared name, appeared at their door with a desperation that seemed to glow off his skin. He had run from a plantation 40 miles south, where the master had beaten him nearly to death for the crime of protecting his sister from assault, and he had nowhere to go, no resources, no plan, beyond the vague direction of north. Joseph had sent him to Rebecca, trusting that her network might be able to help. "I can't go back," Samuel said, his voice breaking. "If I go back, he'll kill me for running, and if I don't go back, my sister pays the price. But if I could get north, if I could get free and earn money, maybe I could buy her freedom someday. That's my only hope." Rebecca looked at this broken young man, perhaps 20 years old, and saw every person she had ever known who had been crushed by the machinery of bondage,
and she made a decision that terrified and exhilarated her in equal measure. "We'll get you north," she said. "We'll write you papers that say you're a free man traveling to visit family in Philadelphia. We'll give you directions to safe houses along the way. We'll do everything we can. But Samuel, you have to understand that if you're caught, if they make you talk, if they trace these papers back to their source, you'll be killing more than yourself." Samuel nodded, understanding the weight being placed on his shoulders. "I won't talk," he said. "I'll die first." Over the next week, the women in the circle created the most elaborate forgery they had yet attempted, freedom papers claiming that Samuel had been manumitted by a fictional master in North Carolina, had worked for wages as a free laborer, and was now traveling to Philadelphia to seek employment. They included dates that seemed plausible, references to real places along the route he would travel, language that matched legitimate documents they had studied. Rebecca taught Samuel to read his own papers so he could answer questions about them if stopped, drilling him until he could recite every detail without hesitation. Joseph provided him with tools hidden in a false bottom of a traveling bag, things that could be sold for money or used for protection, and maps sketched from memory of those who had traveled north before. Dinah packed him food that would last several days, and Esther taught him spirituals that contained coded information about safe routes, how to listen for the drinking gourd constellation, how to recognize marks on trees that indicated friendly houses. When Samuel left on a moonless night in early March, vanishing into darkness like a ghost, the women gathered in their usual circle but couldn't begin their lesson. They simply sat in silence, each lost in prayers and hopes for a young man they barely knew, but for whom they had risked everything.
2 weeks later, a traveling preacher who sometimes visited the plantation and who Joseph trusted with certain secrets passed word that a young man answering Samuel's description had made it to Pennsylvania, was working in a factory, and had sent back a single message. The papers held, "Thank those who wrote them. Tell them what they taught me saved my life." Rebecca cried that night, tears she couldn't fully explain. Grief and joy and terror and pride all mixed together until she didn't know which emotion was which. "We did it," Lizzie whispered in the darkness. "We really did it." But Miriam's voice carried a warning. "We did it once. Now the question is how many more times we can do it before our luck runs out." That question haunted Rebecca in the weeks that followed, because success bred demand, and demand brought exposure. Word spread through the invisible networks that connected enslaved communities across Virginia, whispered in field rows and at creek banks and in the spaces between prayers, that somewhere near Charles City County there was a woman who could write freedom. People began appearing at a cabin, sent by Joseph or by others who had heard stories, each carrying their own desperate need for papers that might save a life, reunite a family, create a chance at liberty. Rebecca wanted to help them all, but she knew that quantity increased risk exponentially, that every pass they created was a potential thread that could unravel their entire operation. She tried to be selective, to only help those in the most dire circumstances. But how did one measure desperation among the enslaved? How could she choose between a father trying to reach a daughter sold away and a woman trying to save a son from a master who had sworn to work him to death? The decision was made for her when one of the people seeking help turned out to be a trap. His name was Moses, or so he claimed, a middle-aged man who said he needed a pass to attend his mother's deathbed 3 counties away, who had tears in his eyes and a story that sounded entirely plausible, who was actually working for Crenshaw, planted in the enslaved community to root out exactly the kind of resistance Rebecca represented. She didn't know any of this when she agreed to help him, didn't suspect when she showed him the letters of his mother's fictional name and taught him to recognize them so he could answer questions about the pass, didn't realize she was being studied even as she taught. It was Lizzie who sensed something wrong, some instinct the girl couldn't articulate but trusted nonetheless. "Miss Rebecca," she whispered after Moses had left with his pass, "something about that man didn't sit right with me. The way he looked at us, like he was memorizing more than just his letters." Rebecca felt cold dread settle in her stomach. "Did anyone else feel that way?" she asked the circle. Miriam nodded slowly.
I didn't want to say nothing and sound foolish, but yes, there was something off about him. His desperation felt performed, like he was acting a role. They agreed to be extra cautious, to watch for any signs that their secret had been compromised. But it was already too late. The trap had been sprung, and they just didn't know it yet. 3 days later, Moses was caught deliberately trying to use the pass at a checkpoint near the county line, caught in a way that seemed designed to draw attention, and when questioned, he immediately confessed to having obtained forged papers from a woman on the Thornhill plantation who teaches reading and writing in secret at night. Crenshaw brought the news to Marcus Thornhill with barely concealed glee, seeing in this revelation a chance to demonstrate his value and perhaps earn a bonus for exposing such a dangerous conspiracy. Thornhill's reaction was everything Crenshaw had hoped for, fury mixed with a sense of personal betrayal, as if the enslaved people on his plantation had violated some contract of gratitude they supposedly owed him. "Find this woman," he ordered. "I want to know who she is, who's been helping her, and who's been learning from her. I want every person involved punished in a way that ensures this never happens again on my property." Crenshaw organized a search of all the cabins that night, looking for evidence of the secret school, books, papers, writing implements, anything that would identify the teacher and her students. Rebecca had moments of warning, a child who overheard the plans and ran to tell Joseph, who in turn sent word to the cabin. But moments were all she had, barely enough time to hide the most incriminating materials, to burn some papers in the fire, to push books into hiding spots that had been prepared for exactly this emergency, to scatter the slate and chalk to different locations, to wipe away the letters practiced in the dirt floor. When Crenshaw and his men burst into the cabin, they found 7 women in their sleeping places, faces carefully composed into expressions of confusion and fear that weren't entirely feigned, and nothing immediately visible that proved guilt. But Crenshaw wasn't stupid, and he had the testimony of Moses to guide him, describing a woman of about 30 years, light-skinned, who worked in the big house, who spoke with unusual precision when she thought no one was listening. That description fit Rebecca, and Crenshaw knew it, but he needed proof, something tangible to present to Thornhill that would justify the brutal punishment he was eager to inflict. "Search them," he ordered his men. "Search every inch of this cabin and every woman in it." What followed was a violation that went beyond the physical searching of bodies and belongings. It was an attempt to strip away the last shreds of dignity and privacy these women possessed, to remind them that they owned nothing, not even the secrets of their own minds.
The men tore through the cabin with vicious efficiency, dumping out the few possessions the women had, breaking what little they valued, searching for the evidence Crenshaw craved. And they almost didn't find it. Rebecca had hidden the most damning materials well, had prepared for this possibility for months, but she hadn't counted on Abigail Thornhill's vindictive memory. The master's wife had noticed books going missing from the library, had mentioned it to her husband weeks before without much concern, but when she heard about the search for an enslaved person who could read, she remembered Rebecca's moment of hesitation when handling that volume of essays, the way the woman's eyes had tracked across the words before catching herself. "Check the woman who attends to me," Abigail told Crenshaw when he reported that the initial search had found nothing definitive. "Rebecca is the one, I'm certain of it." Crenshaw returned to the cabin with renewed purpose and conducted a more thorough search of Rebecca specifically, and this time he found what he was looking for, a scrap of paper tucked into the hem of her dress, a single page torn from the Bible, with notes in the margin in Rebecca's own handwriting, explaining the meaning of a difficult passage, in language that proved beyond any doubt that the writer could read and write with sophisticated comprehension. "Gotcha," Crenshaw breathed, holding the page up like a trophy. Rebecca felt the world tilt beneath her feet, knowing that this moment meant the end of everything she had built, the end, perhaps, of her life, but she forced herself to stand straight, to meet Crenshaw's eyes with all the defiance she had been hiding for years. "Yes," she said clearly, her voice ringing through the cabin. "I can read, I can write, I can think. I am human, Mr. Crenshaw, fully human, no matter what your laws say, and you can punish me for that, but you cannot make it untrue." The silence that followed her words was absolute, broken only when Crenshaw struck her across the face with the back of his hand, the blow hard enough to split her lip and send her to her knees. But even as blood filled her mouth, Rebecca smiled, because she had said aloud what she had been teaching in whispers, and that truth, once spoken, could not be unspoken. They dragged her from the cabin that night, and the other women watched with faces that revealed nothing, but hearts that were breaking, because they knew that Rebecca had just sacrificed herself to protect them, had claimed sole responsibility for the teaching, had not mentioned their names or their lessons or their growing literacy. Crenshaw took Rebecca to a small building that served as a jail for enslaved people awaiting punishment or sale, a windowless structure that smelled of despair and old blood, and locked her inside to await Marcus Thornhill's judgment.
In the darkness of that cell, Rebecca thought about all the words she had learned, all the letters she had taught, all the passes she had written, and she wondered if it had been worth it, if the cost she was about to pay balanced the accounts of resistance and hope. She thought of Samuel making it to Pennsylvania, of Celia seeing her son, of Dinah's grandson who might now learn to read from his grandmother, of all the women in the circle who had stolen back pieces of their humanity, one letter at a time. And she decided, there in the dark, with blood drying on her chin and her fate uncertain, that yes, it had been worth it, that some things mattered more than survival, that dignity and knowledge and the assertion of one's humanity were worth any price, even the ultimate one. The next morning, Marcus Thornhill came to the jail with Crenshaw and Abigail, the latter looking smugly satisfied at having identified the culprit, and demanded that Rebecca confess everything. Every person she had taught, every document she had forged, every enslaved person she had helped escape. "You are my property," Thornhill said, his voice tight with controlled rage, "and you have not just broken the law, but violated the trust I placed in you. I could have you hanged for what you've done, for teaching others to read, for forging documents, for aiding runaways. The law would support me completely." Rebecca looked at him with eyes that held no fear, only a kind of pity that enraged him more than defiance would have. "I am not your property," she said quietly. "I am a human being who happens to be enslaved by you, which is a circumstance of power, not a fact of nature. You can kill me, Master Thornhill, but you cannot make me property. That is not within your power, no matter what your laws claim." Thornhill's face flushed red. "Who else can read? Who else did you teach?" Rebecca smiled slightly. "No one. I worked alone. I taught no one. Whatever papers you think exist came from me and me alone." It was a lie transparent enough that even Thornhill didn't believe it, but it was also a wall he could not break through, because Rebecca repeated it to every question, through every threat, with unchanging consistency. "I worked alone. I taught no one. I forged documents by myself." Crenshaw wanted to whip the truth out of her, suggested it eagerly to Thornhill, but the master hesitated, not from mercy, but from a kind of superstitious fear that had crept into his mind, because Rebecca's calm defiance in the face of certain punishment was something he couldn't categorize or control, and it unsettled him. Finally, he made his decision. "You will be sold," he said, "sold to the Deep South, to a cotton plantation in Mississippi where they know how to handle troublemakers like you, where reading and writing won't help you because you'll work from sunup to sundown until this rebellious spirit is broken or you die. That is my judgment."
It was in some ways worse than execution, because the cotton plantations of the Deep South were death sentences delivered slowly, places where enslaved people were worked to exhaustion and beyond, where the average life expectancy after arrival was less than 7 years, where hope went to die in the merciless heat and back-breaking labor. But it also meant Rebecca would live, at least for a while, and where there was life, there was possibility. She was given no chance to say goodbye to the women in the cabin, no opportunity to leave them with final words or instructions, but she hoped they would understand, would take the lessons she had taught and keep them alive, would continue teaching others in turn, until the whispers after midnight became a chorus that tyranny could not silence. 2 days later, a slave trader named Edmund Ricks came to collect Rebecca, paying Thornhill a price that was lower than her actual value because her reputation as a literate troublemaker had preceded her. But Thornhill accepted it anyway, eager to remove the contamination from his plantation. As Rebecca was led away in chains, she saw the women from the cabin watching from a distance: Dinah, Celia, Sarah, Miriam, Esther, and Lizzie. And though they could not speak, their eyes said everything: gratitude, sorrow, determination, promise. Rebecca nodded once, a gesture of farewell and faith, and then she was gone, heading south toward Mississippi and an uncertain fate. But what Marcus Thornhill and Samuel Crenshaw didn't know, couldn't have known, was that Rebecca's teaching had already spread far beyond those 6 women, had created ripples that would become waves. Dinah did teach her grandson, who grew up to teach others, creating a lineage of literacy that would span generations. Celia used her reading skills to help coordinate resistance activities across 3 counties, becoming a key figure in the local Underground Railroad network. Sarah wrote down the stories of those who had died, creating a memorial in words that preserved their names and lives when no other record existed. Miriam eventually escaped north using papers she forged herself, settling in Canada where she opened a school for formerly enslaved people and taught reading and writing until her death at 73. Esther's spirituals, encoding lessons about letters and freedom, spread across the South and are still sung in some communities today, their original double meaning lost to most but preserved in the tradition. And young Lizzie became perhaps the most remarkable legacy of all, using her literacy to document slave narratives after the Civil War, interviewing hundreds of formerly enslaved people, and recording their testimonies in books that would eventually help shape historical understanding of the era.
But Rebecca knew nothing of these future achievements as the slave trader's wagon carried her south, the Virginia landscape she had known all her life gradually giving way to unfamiliar territory, the February cold slowly warming as they traveled toward deeper southern latitudes. Edmund Ricks was a professional trafficker in human beings, a man who had made his fortune from the domestic slave trade that flourished in the decades before the Civil War, and he treated Rebecca with the impersonal efficiency of someone handling valuable but troublesome livestock. He had shackled her to 3 other enslaved people in the wagon: a young man named Jacob who was being sold away from his family for the crime of learning blacksmith skills too well, and thus becoming a potential competition to free white craftsmen; an older woman named Ruth who was being sold because she could no longer work at the pace the plantation demanded, and her master saw no point in supporting those who couldn't labor; and a teenage girl named Hannah, who had committed the unforgivable sin of resisting a white man's advances and was being disposed of before she could cause more problems. They were a wagon full of the enslaved system's surplus and troublemakers, people whose humanity had become inconvenient to their owners, heading toward buyers who specialized in extracting every last ounce of labor from bodies and spirits before discarding them. The journey took 3 weeks, traveling rough roads through Virginia, North Carolina, Tennessee, and finally into Mississippi, stopping at night in pens that held enslaved people awaiting sale or transfer, places that reeked of unwashed bodies and human waste, where food was minimal and hope was not existent. During those weeks, Rebecca taught Jacob, Ruth, and Hannah their letters, whispering lessons in the dark hours when Rix and his assistants slept, because she literally could not stop herself, because teaching had become as necessary to her as breathing, because in the act of sharing knowledge, she asserted her humanity and theirs in the face of systematic dehumanization. Jacob learned quickly despite his exhaustion and despair, finding in the letters a distraction from the family he had been torn from, a mental exercise that kept him sane. Ruth learned slowly but with quiet determination, saying that if she was going to die on a cotton plantation, she wanted to die knowing she had been more than what her masters thought she was. Hannah learned with an intensity that bordered on obsession, as if literacy was a weapon she could use against those who had hurt her, and perhaps it was. By the time they reached Mississippi, all 3 could write their names, could read simple passages, could do basic arithmetic, could carry forward the knowledge Rebecca had given them to others if they survived long enough to pass it on.
When they arrived at the plantation that had purchased Rebecca, a massive cotton operation owned by a man named Josiah Blackwood, who had a reputation for brutality that made Marcus Thornhill look merciful by comparison, she was separated from Jacob, Ruth, and Hannah, sold to different buyers at the auction held in Jackson, and she never learned what became of them, though she hoped they survived, hoped they remembered their letters, hoped they taught others in turn. The Blackwood plantation was hell on earth in ways that defy adequate description, a place where enslaved people were worked literally to death in the cotton fields, where food was insufficient, shelter was inadequate, medical care was non-existent, and punishment was creative in its cruelty, designed not just to hurt, but to destroy the spirit. Josiah Blackwood believed that enslaved people needed to be kept in a state of constant fear and exhaustion to prevent rebellion, and he structured every aspect of the plantation to achieve that goal. Work quotas that were impossible to meet, punishments for failing to meet them that were severe enough to maim, rewards that were token at best and always dependent on his arbitrary favor. Rebecca was assigned to the fields immediately, given a cotton sack and a quota of 200 pounds a day, a weight that would require her to pick from before dawn until well after dark, with barely a moment's rest. The overseer, a man named Jedediah Morse, who made Crenshaw look restrained, informed her that failure to meet quota would result in lashings, and persistent failure would result in worse. The first few days were agony. Rebecca had never worked in fields before, had always been a house servant, and her hands were not calloused for this kind of labor. The cotton bolls tore at her fingers. The sun beat down on her back with merciless intensity. The weight of the sack increased with agonizing slowness as she moved down the endless rows. She failed to meet quota those first days and received the promised lashings, Morse enthusiastic in his application of the whip. But she gritted her teeth and endured, because she had survived worse, had endured the death of everything she had built in Virginia, and if she could survive that, she could survive this. But it wasn't just physical survival that concerned Rebecca. It was whether she could maintain her sense of self, her humanity, her belief that literacy and knowledge mattered in a place that seemed designed to crush all 3. She was surrounded by people who had been on the Blackwood plantation for years, some for decades, people whose eyes had gone dead, whose movements were mechanical, who seemed to have forgotten they were human and become the machines Blackwood treated them as. Yet even here, even in this hell, Rebecca found pockets of resistance, small acts of humanity that persisted despite everything.
There was an older man named Isaiah who led prayers on Sunday afternoons when work paused briefly. Prayers that contained coded messages about endurance and hope, and the eventual judgment that would come upon oppressors. There was a woman named Catherine who sang while she worked, songs that carried messages about who was sick, who needed help, who was planning to run, all disguised in melodies that overseers heard as simple field hollers. There was a young man named Thomas who had taught himself to identify edible plants, and would supplement the insufficient rations with greens and roots gathered in the brief moments between work and sleep, sharing what he found with those who were weakest. And there was Rebecca herself, who after a month of brutal adjustment to fieldwork, began once again to teach, because she could not teach, because it was who she was. She started with Isaiah, teaching him during their brief Sunday rest periods, using a stick to draw letters in the dirt while pretending to pray, explaining sounds and symbols in whispers that looked like spiritual conversations. Isaiah was 70 years old and had been enslaved his entire life, had never imagined literacy was possible for someone like him. But Rebecca showed him that age was no barrier to learning, that the human mind could absorb new knowledge at any stage if given the chance. Within weeks, Isaiah could read simple passages from the Bible he carried, a precious possession he had guarded for decades without being able to access its contents. And the joy on his face when he read aloud for the first time made every risk Rebecca took worthwhile. Catherine was next, learning letters through the songs she sang, Rebecca teaching her to recognize written words that corresponded to the lyrics she knew by heart, creating a bridge between oral and written literacy that felt natural and unforced. Thomas learned reading and arithmetic together, understanding that numbers and letters were just different systems of symbols representing ideas, and he used his new knowledge to calculate exactly how much Blackwood was cheating them on their rations, how much cotton they picked versus how much reached market, how much profit the plantation made from their unpaid labor, cold, hard numbers that quantified the theft of their lives. The secret school on the Blackwood plantation was even more dangerous than the one in Virginia had been, because Josiah Blackwood's response to the discovery of literacy among his enslaved workers would be immediate and lethal. He had once cut off a man's fingers for teaching himself to count, had sold a woman's children because she was caught writing her name.
But the danger made the teaching more precious, not less, because every letter learned was a victory against dehumanization. Every word read was an assertion of mind over matter. Every calculation completed was proof that enslaved people were thinking, reasoning beings who understood exactly what was being done to them. By the end of Rebecca's first year in Mississippi, she had taught 15 people to read at various levels, had created a network of literacy that spread across the plantation like roots beneath the soil, invisible but growing. And that network began to produce fruits that went beyond personal enlightenment. People who could read could decipher the newspapers that sometimes made it to the plantation, could learn about the growing abolitionist movement in the North, could understand that their bondage was not universal, that in other parts of the country and world, slavery was being challenged and even abolished. They could read wanted posters and understand the patterns of slave catchers, could forge passes with increasing sophistication, could communicate across distances by writing letters that friendly whites might carry, could document the abuses they suffered in ways that might someday matter. Rebecca taught them to see literacy not just as personal achievement, but as political power, the power to understand their own oppression, to articulate it, to eventually resist it in organized rather than individual ways. This was the beginning of something that terrified slaveholders across the South, the emergence of an educated enslaved population that could think systematically about freedom, could plan escapes with greater sophistication, could communicate and coordinate in ways that illiterate people couldn't, could challenge the ideological foundations of slavery by proving through their own accomplishments that the racist justifications for bondage were lies. And Rebecca was at the center of this quiet revolution, a woman who had been sold south to be broken, but who instead became a teacher of teachers, whose lessons spread across plantations, as those she taught were themselves sold or traded, carrying literacy like seeds into new soil. But such achievements could not remain hidden forever, and the consequences, when they came, were devastating. It was a betrayal, as these things often were, not malicious but desperate, that exposed Rebecca's teaching. A young man named Samuel, no relation to the other Samuel from Virginia, had learned to read from Thomas and had decided to use his new skills to forge a pass and attempt escape. The freedom papers he created were good, would have passed most inspections, but he was caught by patrollers who specialized in finding runaways, and under torture he revealed where he had learned to read and write. The information traveled fast, from the patrollers to Josiah Blackwood, who assembled his overseers and set out to crush this literacy network with overwhelming force.
They came at night, dragging people from their sleep, demanding to know who could read, who had been teaching, beating those who wouldn't confess, threatening to sell children if parents didn't talk. The terror lasted for hours, and in the end, 15 names emerged, all those Rebecca had taught directly, and one name that appeared in every interrogation, Rebecca Hayes, the woman from Virginia who taught freedom in whispers. Blackwood ordered her brought before him at dawn, And when she stood in his presence, hands still bearing the scars of cotton picking, face still showing the defiance that no amount of cruelty had managed to break, he looked at her with something approaching awe and rage mixed together. "You've been here 1 year," he said slowly, "and you've infected my property with this literacy poison, turned simple field hands into rebellious troublemakers who think they have rights, who think they can read and write like white people. Do you understand what you've done? Do you comprehend the damage?" Rebecca met his eyes without flinching. "I've taught human beings to exercise their human capacities. I've helped enslaved people reclaim the parts of themselves you tried to steal. I've committed no crime except in a system so morally bankrupt that it criminalizes knowledge itself." Blackwood struck her, his fist catching her temple and sending her to the ground, but she pulled herself back to her feet, blood trickling from her hairline, and continued speaking. "You can beat me, you can kill me, but you cannot undo what's been done. Those 15 people will teach others, who will teach others still, and eventually the children of enslaved people will be able to read the very laws that enslave them and understand the fundamental injustice of their bondage. That's what terrifies you, isn't it? Not the reading itself, but what literacy enables, the clear-eyed understanding of oppression and the ability to articulate alternatives." The punishment Blackwood devised was calculated to destroy not just Rebecca, but the network she had created, to serve as a warning so severe that no one would dare teach or learn again. He ordered that Rebecca be whipped publicly, 100 lashes administered over the course of several hours to ensure she remained conscious for the entire ordeal, and that the 15 people she had taught be forced to watch, made to see the consequences of accepting her instruction. It was psychological warfare as much as physical punishment, an attempt to make the students feel responsible for their teacher's suffering, to break the bonds of community and mutual support that literacy had fostered. The whipping was carried out by Jedediah Morse, who approached the task with grim enthusiasm, and Rebecca endured it as she had endured everything else, with a courage that seemed superhuman until her consciousness finally fled around the 80th lash.
But even broken and bloody, even near death from the severity of the beating, Rebecca had achieved something Blackwood couldn't destroy. She had planted ideas that would outlive her body, had created knowledge that would spread beyond his control, had demonstrated through her very existence and resistance that enslaved people were fully human and deserving of all human rights and dignities. She was returned to her cabin more dead than alive, and the enslaved community on the Blackwood plantation faced a choice: accept defeat and abandon literacy to prevent further punishment, or continue what Rebecca had started, despite the risks. The decision came from an unexpected source. Isaiah, the 70-year-old man who had been the first person Rebecca taught in Mississippi, stood up at the next Sunday gathering and read aloud from the Bible he had guarded all those years, his voice strong and clear, the words flowing from the page through his lips into the air where everyone could hear them. "The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want," he read, and the simple act of that reading, performed openly rather than in secret, was itself an act of rebellion and faith. "He maketh me to lie down in green pastures. He leadeth me beside still waters. He restoreth my soul." Others joined in, those Rebecca had taught reading the words even as they recited from memory, creating a chorus of literate resistance that declared they would not be intimidated back into ignorance, would not let Rebecca's sacrifice be meaningless, would continue learning and teaching no matter what punishment awaited. Blackwood heard about this act of defiance and was preparing another round of brutal suppression when events beyond his control intervened. The year was 1854, and the nation was moving inexorably toward the crisis that would become the Civil War. Tensions over slavery were reaching breaking points, and violence was beginning to erupt in border states like Kansas, where pro- and anti-slavery forces fought openly. The Blackwood plantation was not immune to these larger forces, and as political tensions rose, economic pressures increased. Cotton prices fluctuated wildly, and Blackwood found himself facing financial difficulties that made the internal management of his enslaved population less of a priority than simply keeping the operation solvent. Rebecca survived her whipping against all odds.
her body healing slowly with the help of Catherine, who had knowledge of herbal medicine and tended her wounds with skills learned from her grandmother, a root worker who had been sold away years before, but whose teachings lived on. It took months for Rebecca to recover enough to work again, and when she returned to the fields, she was changed. Not broken, but tempered like steel, harder and softer simultaneously, her mercy deepened by suffering even as her determination became unshakable.
She continued teaching, more carefully now, with greater caution and better security, using methods that had evolved from her earlier mistakes. Instead of gathering students in groups where one betrayal could expose many, she taught individuals who would then teach others, creating a decentralized network that couldn't be destroyed by a single informant or raid. Instead of using materials that could be found and used as evidence, she taught primarily through verbal instruction and memory, having students learn to visualize letters and words, to practice writing in their minds before ever touching pen to paper. Instead of claiming credit or becoming a visible center of the operation, she faded into the background, becoming just another field hand, while the knowledge she shared spread through invisible channels. Word of mouth, whispered lessons, secrets passed like heirlooms from person to person. By 1857, 3 years after her brutal whipping, nearly half the enslaved people on the Blackwood plantation could read at some level, an achievement that would have seemed impossible to anyone who understood the risks and constraints under which they operated. Yet there it was, a quiet revolution of the mind that had succeeded despite everything slavery had done to prevent it. And Rebecca, now 36 years old, her body bearing the permanent scars of bondage, but her mind as sharp and fierce as ever, had become something she never intended, a legend, a symbol, an inspiration to those who knew her story and those who only heard whispers of a woman who taught freedom after midnight, even when teaching cost her everything. The Civil War, when it finally came in 1861, found Rebecca still on the Blackwood plantation, still teaching, still resisting in the only way available to her, through education and the assertion of humanity. The war years were chaotic and brutal, Union and Confederate armies moving across the Mississippi landscape, requisitioning supplies, conscripting enslaved men for labor, disrupting the rhythms of plantation life, even as the institution of slavery itself began to fracture under the pressures of military conflict. Josiah Blackwood died in 1862, killed not in battle but by cholera, a common disease that struck down masters and enslaved people alike with democratic impartiality, and his plantation fell into the hands of his son Marcus Blackwood, Jr., a less cruel but equally committed enslaver who tried to maintain the operation as war raged around them. Rebecca lived to see the approach of Union troops in 1863, to hear the distant thunder of cannons and the rumors of emancipation, to feel the first stirrings of hope that freedom might come not through escape but through liberation, that the system itself might finally collapse under its own moral bankruptcy and military defeat. When soldiers in blue uniforms finally arrived at the Blackwood plantation in August of 1863, having pushed Confederate forces back from the area, they found a population of enslaved people who were far more educated and organized than most, who could read the proclamations about emancipation, who could write their own names on the enlistment papers for those who chose to join the Union cause, who could calculate their own back wages, if such things were ever to be honored, who could document the crimes committed against them, if such documentation ever mattered to a court. And at the center of this literate community stood Rebecca Hayes, now 42 years old, scarred but unbroken, who had spent 3 decades of her life teaching others what the law said they had no right to know, and who lived to see the beginning of slavery's end. The aftermath of the Civil War was complex and often disappointing. Emancipation came, but economic freedom remained elusive. Political rights were granted and then systematically stripped away. The promise of Reconstruction gave way to the betrayal of Jim Crow, and the hard-won literacy that enslaved people had risked everything to acquire became both a tool for advancement and a target for those who wanted to maintain white supremacy through other means. But Rebecca's legacy lived on in ways that mattered. She moved to New Orleans after the war, joining the flood of formerly enslaved people seeking opportunity in cities, and there she opened a school for freed people, teaching adults and children alike to read and write, operating first from a church basement and eventually from a dedicated building funded by Northern abolitionists and local community members. She taught for 23 years, until her death in 1886 at the age of 65, and in that time she directly educated more than 2,000 people, who in turn educated tens of thousands more,
creating cascading effects of literacy that spread across the South and beyond. Among her students were people who became teachers themselves, preachers who could read the Bible to their congregations, business owners who could keep their own books, politicians who could write legislation, journalists who could document the continuing struggle for civil rights, and parents who could read to their children, breaking the cycle of enforced illiteracy that slavery had imposed. Rebecca never married, never had children of her own, but she left descendants nonetheless, generations of educated people who traced their literacy back to her teaching, who carried forward her belief that knowledge was both a right and a weapon, who understood that the fight for freedom included the fight for education, and who honored her memory by continuing to teach others, even when teaching was dangerous, difficult, or thankless.
In the oral histories collected decades later, people who had studied with Rebecca remembered her not just as a teacher, but as a force of nature, a woman who refused to accept that anyone was too old, too damaged, too broken to learn, who saw potential in every student, no matter how challenging their circumstances, who taught not just letters and numbers, but dignity, pride, and the understanding that education was a form of resistance against all forms of oppression. When Rebecca Hayes died in 1886, she was buried in a cemetery in New Orleans reserved for freed people, and her headstone, paid for by her former students, bore a simple inscription chosen by the community she had served. She taught freedom. The funeral drew hundreds of people, filling the church and spilling out into the streets, and speaker after speaker rose to tell stories of how Rebecca had changed their lives, had given them the tools to read contracts before signing them, to write letters to scattered family members, to calculate interest rates on loans, to read newspapers and understand politics, to educate their own children, to demand and sometimes receive dignity in a world still hostile to black advancement. Among those who spoke was Lizzie Thompson, the girl who had been part of Rebecca's original circle in Virginia, now a woman of 61, who had traveled from Canada where she lived and worked as a teacher herself, to honor the woman who had started her on that path. Rebecca believed in us when the world said we were unworthy of belief, Lizzie said, her voice strong despite her tears. She taught us to read when the law said we had no right to learn. She risked her life so we could claim ours. And she never, not once, suggested that the price might be too high, because she understood that freedom of the mind came before freedom of the body, and that once we possessed the first, we could never be truly enslaved again, no matter what chains they put on us. The stories of Rebecca Hayes were passed down through families and communities, sometimes embellished, sometimes simplified, but always carrying the core truth, that one woman's courage in teaching literacy when literacy was forbidden had changed countless lives and contributed to the broader struggle for black freedom and dignity. Her story became part of the larger narrative of enslaved resistance, a reminder that rebellion took many forms, not just armed uprisings like Nat Turner's or escapes via the Underground Railroad, but also quieter, sustained acts of intellectual defiance that challenged the fundamental assumptions of white supremacy by demonstrating black intelligence, creativity, and determination.
Historians would later recognize that literacy movements among enslaved people were crucial precursors to the civil rights movements that followed, that the ability to read and write enabled political organizing, economic advancement, and cultural preservation in ways that would have been impossible otherwise, and that teachers like Rebecca Hayes, working in secret and at great personal risk, had laid groundwork for achievements that wouldn't fully manifest until generations after their deaths. But the most profound legacy Rebecca left wasn't recorded in history books or academic studies. It was in the quiet moments when a grandmother taught her grandchild to read using the same methods Rebecca had taught her, when a parent signed their own name to a legal document instead of making a mark, when a student realized they could understand the written word and thus access knowledge that had been kept from them, when anyone who had been told they were inferior proved otherwise by the simple act of learning. These moments, multiplied millions of times across decades and centuries, were Rebecca's true monument, more lasting than any stone marker, more powerful than any written account. As we reach the end of Rebecca Hayes' story, we must pause to reflect on what her life meant and continues to mean. Rebecca was born into a system designed to dehumanize her, to reduce her to property, to deny her every right and dignity that should belong to any human being. Yet she refused that reduction at every turn, insisted on her humanity through the simple act of learning and teaching,
and in doing so challenged the very foundations of an economic and social order built on the lie of racial hierarchy. Her teaching was an act of love, love for her students, love for her people, love for knowledge itself, love for the idea that human beings deserve to know, to learn, to grow, to become more than circumstances dictate they should be. She paid dearly for that love, endured beatings, sale, separation, near death, and a lifetime of hard labor. Yet she never stopped teaching, because she understood something essential, that the human spirit cannot be permanently contained, that knowledge once gained cannot be truly lost, that literacy shared becomes immortal in a way that individual lives cannot be. Think of Rebecca on those midnight lessons in Virginia, surrounded by women who trusted her enough to risk everything, carefully drawing letters in the dirt by candlelight, whispering explanations of sounds and symbols that could open entire worlds if understood, creating in that small cabin a space where enslaved people could be fully human, fully engaged, fully alive in their minds, even as their bodies remained in bondage.
Think of her in Mississippi, broken and bleeding from her punishment, yet still determined to teach, understanding that her suffering would be meaningless if she allowed it to silence her, choosing defiance not from pride, but from principle, from an unshakable belief that education was a human right that no law could legitimately deny. Think of her in New Orleans after the war, an aging woman who had survived more than most people could imagine, who could have rested on her past achievements, who instead poured her remaining years into teaching others, never seeking fame or recognition, simply doing the work because the work needed doing, because students needed teachers, because the fight for freedom was ongoing and education was one of its most important fronts. Rebecca Hayes lived and died in a world that told her and people like her that they were less than human, and her response was to prove otherwise through the most human of activities, learning and teaching, the passing of knowledge from one mind to another, the building of understanding across generations, the preservation and creation of culture through literacy. She could not end slavery alone, could not vote, could not own property, could not even legally learn to read. Yet she changed her world through the means available to her, through courage, intelligence, persistence, and an absolute refusal to accept that injustice was inevitable or that oppression had to be permanent. Her story reminds us that resistance to tyranny takes many forms, that the quietest rebellions can be the most powerful, that teaching a child to read when teaching is forbidden is as much an act of revolution as taking up arms, that preserving human dignity in the face of systematic dehumanization is heroism of the highest order. And perhaps most importantly, Rebecca's life teaches us that freedom is not a single moment of liberation, but an ongoing process of claiming and reclaiming our humanity, of asserting our right to know, to learn, to grow, to become fully ourselves, despite all the forces that would limit us. The enslaved people she taught did not become free simply because the 13th Amendment was ratified. They became free in their minds first, through literacy and education, and that mental freedom enabled them to claim and defend their legal freedom when it finally arrived, to build institutions, to create communities, to educate their children, to demand rights rather than beg for favors, to stand as citizens rather than kneel as subjects.
Rebecca did not live to see all the fruits of her labor, did not witness the civil rights movement of the 1960s, or the election of black officials to the highest offices in the land, or the opening of educational opportunities that would have been unimaginable in her time. But she planted seeds that grew into all of those things and more, because every act of education, every letter taught, every word read, every document written, contributed to a cumulative tide of knowledge and capability that eventually changed laws, societies, and consciousness itself. As you reach the end of this story, I invite you to honor Rebecca Hayes' memory by valuing education, not just as a means to economic advancement, but as a fundamental human right and a form of resistance against all forms of oppression, by teaching someone something they don't know, by learning something new yourself, by refusing to accept that anyone is incapable of growth, by understanding that knowledge is power and sharing it is love, by recognizing that the struggle for dignity and freedom is ongoing and that each of us has a role to play in it. Before you go, make sure to subscribe to this channel for more stories of courage, resilience, and resistance from history, stories of ordinary people who did extraordinary things, who changed the world through the means available to them, who refused to accept injustice as permanent, who left legacies that continue to inspire and instruct us today. Hit that subscribe button, turn on notifications, and be part of a community that believes in the power of stories to educate, inspire, and transform. Because remembering people like Rebecca Hayes is not just about honoring the past, it's about learning from it, drawing strength from it, and carrying forward the unfinished work of creating a more just and equitable world for all people. Rebecca Hayes taught freedom in whispers after midnight, and those whispers became echoes that still resound today, in every classroom where a child learns to read, in every library that preserves knowledge for all who seek it, in every moment when someone refuses to accept that learning is a privilege rather than a right, in every act of teaching that defies those who would keep others ignorant and thus powerless. She was enslaved but never broken, punished but never silenced, sold south to be destroyed, but instead became a destroyer of chains, not the physical chains of iron that bound her body, but the mental chains of ignorance that enslavers relied upon to maintain their power.
Her life was a testament to human resilience, intelligence, creativity, and courage, a demonstration that the human spirit cannot be permanently contained, no matter how brutal the system designed to suppress it. A reminder that one person teaching truth can change countless lives, and thus change the world, one letter at a time, one word at a time, one student at a time, in whispers that became roars, in midnight lessons that brought the light of dawn to minds steeped in darkness, in acts of love disguised as simple instruction that were actually revolutionary assertions of fundamental human equality and dignity. Remember Rebecca Hayes. Remember her students. Remember all those who taught and learned in secret because teaching and learning were forbidden to them. Remember that the literacy you possess came at a price paid by people like them, people who risked everything so that future generations could read these words about their sacrifice, people who believed in education when the world told them they had no right to it, people whose names are mostly lost, but whose legacy lives on in every book read, every word written, every mind freed from the prison of ignorance, every truth spoken to power, every child who grows up knowing they can learn, they can know, they can become, they can be fully human in a world that tried and failed to convince entire peoples otherwise. This is the story of Rebecca Hayes, who was enslaved but taught freedom, who suffered but created joy, who died in obscurity but left a legacy of light, who whispered when she could have remained silent, who taught when she could have surrendered, who loved when she could have hated, who gave when she had almost nothing, who built when destruction surrounded her, who planted seeds in soil that seemed too hard and poisoned to grow anything, yet those seeds sprouted and spread and became forests of knowledge that provided shelter and sustenance for generations yet unborn. And that forest still stands, still grows, still offers refuge and strength to all who seek the freedom that comes from understanding, from literacy, from the revolutionary simple act of learning to read and teaching others the same, in whispers after midnight, in defiance of those who claimed ownership of bodies but could never truly own minds, in assertion of humanity that no chain could permanently suppress, in hope that no amount of suffering could finally extinguish, in faith that truth and justice would eventually prevail because people like Rebecca Hayes refused to stop believing, teaching, and fighting for a better world, even when that world seemed determined to crush them.
Let her memory be a blessing. Let her sacrifice not be in vain. Let her teaching continue through all of us who tell her story, who honor her legacy, who commit ourselves to the ongoing work of education, liberation, and the assertion of human dignity for all people, regardless of race, class, gender, or any other category that the powerful use to divide and dominate. Let us whisper truth when necessary, but also shout it when possible. Let us teach when we can, and learn always. Let us remember that freedom is not a gift given by the powerful, but a right claimed by the oppressed through struggle, sacrifice, and the absolute refusal to accept their assigned place in hierarchies of human value. And let us go forward knowing that one person with courage and knowledge can change the world, that teaching matters, that learning matters, that resistance in all its forms matters, and that the story of Rebecca Hayes, who taught freedom in whispers after midnight, is not just history, but living inspiration for all who hear it and choose to carry it forward.